Okay, we're going to sew together this block, and I'm going to chain piece, which means instead of sewing my rows together one at a time, I am going to sew my rows together and then connect to the next row. So I'm going to sew these two pieces, not cut my thread, so these two pieces, these two pieces, these two pieces, these two pieces. And then to these two pieces, I'm going to add this piece, and then I'm going to not cut my thread and add this piece, not cut my thread and add this piece. So essentially you're sewing kind of in a column, but as you're sewing down the column, you're sewing your rows together. This is a great thing to try out. It's called web piecing. I have another video with Ghost Party blocks, sewing it this way, and it's fast and effective. I would try the first way I demonstrated and then move into this way. So I'm grabbing my first two pieces, making sure they're in the same order that they're in there. Again, the same things. The edges that were next to each other, I'm putting right sides together. I am going to backstitch on the top, and I have washi tape here on my sewing machine, and that is my 1/4 inch foot because my Juki is not made in the US, so the 1/4 inch mark on it is a little off. Once I get, and my needle is just past my fabric here, I'm going to grab my next two pieces, flip them right sides together, and I took off my table for this just so we could see a little bit better. It does produce a few tricky things because I'm used to having that extra surface here, but see how I just continued sewing and fed the top of those squares right through, and now I've hit the end of these two squares, so I'm going to grab the next two squares. You could grab them and then you could flip them like this and then grab them and put them right sides together up here, whatever is comfortable. The main thought with this is just keeping them in the right order. So however you do that is great. Grabbing my next two. And then the last two for those two columns. So the reason this is faster is because you're not stopping and cutting and pulling out in between each set of squares that you're sewing together. So you're essentially saving thread and time. I'm going to backstitch here at the bottom because it's the outside edge of our block. And then at this point we have 10 squares sewn together in a chain. Now what we're going to do next is we're going to open up these sets of two, and we're going to add the next square in each row to its row. So these are the top two. I'm going to grab the next square in the top row, align it with these two, come to the end, and then I have my next two squares here. I'm going to open them up. Sometimes if I'm doing a very complex block or quilt, because you can do this method for the whole quilt at one time, I take a picture of everything laid out. If it's a whole quilt, I would probably want to print the picture. If it's just a block, I can quick reference my phone picture if I forget where something goes. But this is a pretty simple block, and I think we can manage to get it all in the right place without too much help. Same concept for this is you can align the points on this side with the points of the seam allowance, just like I did before. Here I have to be careful because my seam tends to want to lift up and go the opposite direction it should. If that happens, just make sure your needle is down, lift up your foot, put that seam back under your foot and continue sewing. Things like that happen quite frequently if you're not paying attention or it just happens. And a back stitch at the bottom. So now we have all 5 of our rows together, and each row has 3 blocks on it. So we're going to continue with these 2. I'm going to shift I'm actually going to stack them. I can take the top one because that's how we're sewing, from the top down, and stack them up. And this is just getting wider, so it's going to fall into this space. And I don't want to take the chance of these getting out of order and I don't pay attention. And honestly, after the first 2 columns, I can stack the rest of the rows on top of each other because I'm just going to sew to the bottom of this, and then I'm going to come back to the top and continue sewing the stack of blocks. So that's another way to keep them in nice order. I wouldn't do that with your first 2 columns because of the way you sew it. But after that, if you stack them from top to bottom in the columns, it will be completely fine and they'll be in the proper order. I am really missing my tabletop surface that goes on around my machine. A lot of machines come with that these days. And if you have the option or not to get it, I would recommend it. Just makes it nice to have a little extra space here before your fabric feeds under. We have 4 in each row. Oh, sorry. And they are all connected by strings in between. So there's a couple things that you should think about as I'm sewing this last column on. You do not have to cut apart these rows. Some people I know do, and that's fine too. If it's more manageable for you to iron them and to sew them together, feel free to cut them apart in between, and I'll show you where and how to do that. I typically do not cut them apart and just sew my rows to each other because I believe I mentioned before that when I'm ironing these blocks, if I'm chain piecing, I'm probably waiting to iron till the end. You can't do that for every block, but for something simple like these, you definitely can. Sometimes you have to iron like we did for the points. We had to iron that point out before we could sew on the next one. So there's a lot of piecing and quilting that will be like that as well. Okay, so in theory, we have our whole block sewn together. Does that make sense how we did that? If you wanted to cut these rows apart, you would just snip this thread that's right in between these 2 blocks. Can you see that? And you just snip it. Not a big deal. But if we want to sew these together, I just turned it sideways. This is the top of my block. And I'm going to flip this. The rest of these are still attached by the little strings. I'm going to flip this over onto my next row. And I'm going to line these edges, and I'm going to sew along the edges that were next to each other to seam that together. I'm going to make sure all of the seams on this side, these seams, point in the same direction, and all of the seams on that side point in the opposite direction. And that's because I'm not ironing before I do this. You could still iron this, even if it is pieced together, you haven't cut them apart. You can turn it over and iron all those separate rows. And I think you may have gotten this by now, but I do recommend in all these techniques to try the very basic beginner method that I start with. Try that multiple times. I want you to be comfortable with those methods before you move on to these a little bit more advanced time-saving methods, because while sewing in general, my advice is done is better than perfect. And I think a lot of quilters say that. It is always good to work on our skills and be willing to perfect things. And that happens through practice. We can see all my points are lining up. And now I have 2 rows completely sewn together, still attached to the bottom 3 rows. So we're going to flip that top 2 rows down on top of the 3rd row. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Pay attention again to your seams, which direction they go. They're going to go the opposite now of this first row. And it's good to pay attention when you're not previously ironing them, because they will go any which way. When they're ironed, they're going to tend to fall in the way they're ironed for the most part. When they're not ironed, they're going to be like, hey, what do you want me to do? And kind of do whatever they want, especially when it comes to slightly thicker fabric or where there's additional seams like on these points for the star. Anywhere you have more than like the just 2 pieces of fabric coming together, when you have multiple layers, it's going to tend to want to do its own thing. Hopefully that thing is to fall the way you want it to, but that's not really how it works typically. I always, when I get to the end, try to make sure that those end points are nice and aligned. Okay, we have over half of our block sewn together. So we're just going to sew these last 2 rows. I'm going to pull the top 3 rows down, and it's going to be right sides together with the row 4. Same thing, side to side, checking your seams, nesting them at each intersection, and back stitching at the beginning and end of the row because it's the outside edge of the block. And worst case, you don't backstitch, not a big deal. I think in general, those stitches are gonna hold. Just don't go whipping your blocks from side to side. At the end of the pattern, you may have read this when you pre-read the pattern, you do a victory lap, and that's just stitches around the outside of your quilt top to hold it together. That wasn't my practice for a long time. And I have had quilts fray a ton and the edge seams split when I've been out taking pictures and stuff. So that's why I'd like to do the back stitch on blocks, because it does help with that. 4 rows together, we're going to flip it down and on top. You could also, so we've been sewing by flipping it down and on top, and then we're turning it this way, because it is a little easier to sew when your smaller piece of fabric is on top. You could flip it up this way and sew it this way. It doesn't really matter. The only thing you're going to want to remember is to check the seams. If these seams are on the bottom where you can't see them, we know that when we turn it over, they're facing away from us. So we want to kind of just keep that in mind. That's the only difference when you flip it over, is you can't see the way those bottom seams are supposed to flow. And since they're already seamed in up here, they're set in a specific direction. When this loose one is on the bottom, it's not set in any direction. It is going where we tell it to go. Sometimes I have forgotten which way, and then I'll just lift it up and be like, oh, yep, it goes, the seams go that way. Just double checking. Always better to double check than to be frustrated later that you did it wrong. Ask me how I know that. And again, I'm not suggesting you pull or push your fabric a ton, but if you have to tug a little bit and do a little bit of stretch to get it to just complete the whole edge, like if this was in a little bit from the edge and I had to tug it out just a tiny bit for those points to match, that's totally fine. We don't want to pull it in essence so the machine is not allowing it to go through, but we want to connect those ends, so allowing the give of the fabric to play there is fine. So we have our whole block sewn together chain piece style. I'm going to lift it up here. I'm going to go iron it, and I'll take you with me. It's going to be a little bit different ironing it because it's all together. Same exact concept as before, but we do have to kind of iron more at one time. So let's hop over to the ironing board. Okay, we're here at the ironing board, and for my blue and purple blocks, I know that I'm pushing my horizontal seams down in this direction, this being the top of the block. And this top row is actually coming in this direction. So what I'm going to do is kind of start over here, kind of tugging a little bit on this side, not pulling where I'm stretching stuff, but just tugging enough so our fabric is not getting stuck in creases near seams. Pulling it that way, and then I'm going to start gently pulling it this way to have these seams come down. And if we're lucky, these vertical seams, you probably saw it do that, actually just kind of start to lay flat in the direction that they're sewn, because they want to do that now because that's the direction they're sewn. So anytime we come just to a bunch of seams, we are just going to go slow and make sure we are, if we have to, we're lifting the iron up a little bit to get over those seams. And I'm going to just shift it up a little bit now to reach the bottom, and continuing to just gently tug a little bit, not enough to skew the seams, and that seam is kind of popping up, so be careful. Ironing can be scary because it is very hot. You don't want to iron yourself. You can probably use some sort of seam ripper or tool to like hold something down while you get your iron close to it. And the fabric does get hot too, so just keep that in mind. My daughter is terrified to iron, but someday she'll learn. Okay, here is our block. I'm gonna hold it up. Can we see that? Beautiful block, all chained piece. Thank goodness our fabric is all in the right spots. And I hope that you are inspired to maybe try the chain piecing a little bit and are excited to sew all your blocks together.